I've had a lot happen in the past year that's made me reevaluate where I see myself on the kink BDSM kind of spectrum. Originally, I identified as a submissive switch, but after having a few experiences and a recent dynamic end, I came to the realization that I am more dominant than I allow myself to be. I've run into the problem of trying to shed my good girl mentality. Every time I try and step into my more dominant space, I have this mental block where I immediately feel shame for asserting myself or trying to explore my own desires. So I wanted to know if there were any tips to help me fully own my space. Beautiful question, sweet tea. And yes, I do have some insights for you, my dear. A lot's happened in the past year. It's made me reevaluate kind of like my submissive switch, what's going on. And I identified this after having a few experiences and a recent dynamic end. I came to the realization that I'm more dominant than I allow myself to be, which could 100,000,000,000% be the case. I'm not saying it's not. Your dominant side could very well be coming out. But here's another something to consider. Toxic dominance often trigger the need for control. Toxic dominance often trigger the need for control. So it could be that you're waking up to the fact that you're actually more dominant than you think you are, or it could be toxic experience make you feel unsafe, unseen, I need to take up space. So that's just the first point. I want any submissives or switches who might be questioning some things, whatever, think about that. It might not be that you're more dominant than you think you are. It could be. It could be. But keep in mind, what have your experiences been like? Toxic dominance, unhealthy dominance trigger the need for control because you don't feel safe. You can't trust them. You can't rest. So your mind gets overactive. You don't feel safe. You feel like you need to outplan them because you can't trust their plan. You need to go over and above explaining and communicating because you don't trust their ability to listen. You need to go above and beyond and fiercely protect yourself and set boundaries and come across maybe even controlling or topping their bottom because you don't trust their ability to keep you safe and honor your boundaries. So that's just throwing that out there. Excellent DOMs inspire submissive expression. Toxic DOMs often trigger the need for control. New affirmation unlocked. Good. Good. So again, so it might not be new dominant desires that are coming up, but a reaction showing you that you weren't really safe, that you didn't really feel safe. All right. So there's that. Now, I also want to, I'm going to say this. You guys have heard me say this before. Sweet Tea, you've been gone for a minute, so I don't know if you've heard me say this or not, but for those of you who pay attention, you'll be able to finish this quote. What happens? What happens when we give dysfunction a virtuous name? When we give a dysfunction a virtuous name, who's paying attention? When we give dysfunction a virtuous name, we empower the dysfunction. Well done, Laura. When we give a dysfunction a virtuous name, we empower the dysfunction. And that's kind of what I'm seeing here. Sweet Tea, my darling, you're saying that you struggle shedding the good girl mentality. I think you're misdefining it. I think you're misdefining dominance, and I also think you're misdefining submission, and I also think you're misdefining the good girl mentality. And I think those lies are keeping you bound and not in the good way, honey. So let's break those down here for a minute. First one, you and your question seem to define dominance as asserting yourself and exploring your desires. You said, every time I try to step into my more dominant space, I have this mental block where I immediately feel shame for asserting myself or trying to explore my own desires. So you right now, my dear, are linking more dominant space equals asserting yourself more dominant space equals exploring your desires. And that might feel dominant to you, but here's the thing, that's not technically domination. That's someone who values themselves and isn't afraid to take up space. That's not technically domination. So you are saying my more dominant space is me asserting myself and exploring my own desires. No. You just don't value yourself enough to do so. And you doing so doesn't technically make you dominant. It makes you an empowered woman who knows your worth. And you could be that as a dominant or as a submissive. You can be that as a switch. You can be that as a submissive switch. You can be that as a dominant switch. But that as a definition, I think is empowering the dysfunction. Asserting yourself is not necessarily dominant. I demand that my submissives assert themselves. Exploring your desires and being honest about them is not technically dominant. I demand that my submissives explore their desires and fucking communicate. Because I value my submissives and I fucking demand that they value themselves too. That hit you hard? Okay, so that's what I was saying. When we give dysfunction a virtuous name, we empower the dysfunction. I'm going to keep going. You are misdefining good girl. You said, I've run into the problem of trying to shed my good girl mentality. And so I reverse engineered what you consider dominant as what you consider good girl. And if you consider dominant as asserting yourself and exploring your desires, you are defining good girl as submissive, because that's antithetical to the dom space that you're having trouble with. And then you're defining submissive as the opposite of dominant. And if you define dominance as asserting yourself and exploring your desires, you subconsciously are defining submissive as self-betrayal, no voice, and no power. And then you're defining that as being a good girl. That's your problem. You have the wrong definition for good girl. So as long as you're trying to be the good girl and your definition of being a good girl is I have to betray myself, I have to have no voice and no power, yeah, that's gonna keep you locked into this shame spiral and mislabeling it as dominance when really it's just you loving yourself, valuing yourself. So here's the thing. Who says? Who says? Says who? Who says that good girl equals self-betrayal, no sense of worth, no sense of value, and no voice? Who says that? I certainly haven't said it. No one here has said it. So who defined that for you? And furthermore, it's time to challenge the lie. And it's time to reframe it with truth. It's time for you to stop calling codependency and self-betrayal and no self-worth and no voice and no power. It's time to stop calling that being a good girl. That's not being a good girl. That's having no value, no respect for yourself, no honor for yourself. Because here's the thing, honey, we accept the love and treatment we think we deserve. So if you don't feel like you deserve honor, you're not going to demand it. And if you feel like the only way for you to be a good girl is not being honored, that's what's keeping you in this cycle. You are misdefining good girl, you're misdefining submission, and you're misdefining dominance and leadership. And it sounds to me like the experiences or the dynamic that you had have not been at the hands of a healthy dominant. Because at the hands of a healthy dominant, you get more submissive. You open up more, you get soft, you get more exploratory. None of that has happened. So I would beg to say, nah, maybe it was called a dynamic or maybe someone called themselves dominant, but the aftermath is showing me that's not what happened.